The global supply chain crisis, we've all heard about it, we've all even felt the impact of it. And now the ongoing war in Ukraine and the global sanctions on Russia are straining global supply chains even more. So what does this mean for all of us? We'll tackle this today in our special broadcast of the WION-VOA Co-Production with me, Priyanka Sharma. We'll also take a look at what's specifically happening in Bucha. The chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, visited the mass graves in Bucha in Ukraine, telling reporters afterwards that Ukraine is a crime scene. The United States says that it will help document those crimes. VOA's Saine brings us this next report. Take a look.
War crimes prosecutors visited the town of Bucha, near Ukraine's capital Wednesday, promising to follow the evidence as forensic experts began their work. The chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court spoke to reporters.
Every individual, particularly civilians, they have certain rights, and we must speak for them, and we must insist that we get to the truth of what's taken place, and then judges will decide if there's responsibility.
The ICC, which is based in The Hague, Netherlands, has begun investigating alleged Russian war crimes in Ukraine. Neither Russia nor the U.S. is a member of the world body. The top U.S. diplomat for Ukraine said the world now knows that Russian President Vladimir Putin was lying when he claimed atrocities in cities and towns across Ukraine were faked or staged.
The world knows that he's responsible for the train station blast in Kramatorsk. He's responsible for the atrocities committed in Bucha. He's responsible for the devastation in Mariupol. He's responsible for the devastation in Kharkiv, and there's no one else that he can point the finger to, and the world knows that.
At the State Department briefing Wednesday, spokesperson Ned Price was repeatedly asked why the U.S. was not pursuing its own war crimes investigation in Ukraine, and if President Joe Biden was premature in using the word genocide.
We are engaged in a process at this very moment to work with partners around the world, but in the first instance, our Ukrainian partners, to help them collect, to preserve, to document, and to share evidence of atrocities, potential war crimes, and yes, if that threshold, that legal threshold is reached, genocide. We are working very closely with the Office of the Ukrainian Prosecutor General, who has set up a team under her purview to initiate a criminal case with an eye towards potential prosecution.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has called for Putin to be brought before an international tribunal.
All the world's leading states have already condemned Russia's attack on Kramatorsk. We expect a firm global response to this war crime. Like the massacres in Bucha, like many other Russian war crimes, the missile strike on Kramatorsk must be one of the charges at the tribunal, which is bound to happen.
Experts tell VOA that as long as Russian soldiers remain in Russia, access to them is almost impossible. But they said holding war crimes trials to shame and blame perpetrators can still make sense.
Now, holding war crimes trials, even in absentia, can have a deterrent effect on saying, the lower ranks might say, hey, I don't want to make myself vulnerable to a potential war crimes prosecution. And basically that means you're stuck in Russia for life, because if you leave the country, you can be prosecuted anywhere under what's called universal jurisdiction. And that applies to Vladimir Putin as well.
On Tuesday, Putin said the reported war crimes in Bucha were fabricated without offering any evidence and contradicting evidence collected from mass graves and numerous eyewitness reports. Saine, VOA News.
And to speak about this further, we're now joined by Voice of America's correspondent Chris Casquejo from Washington. Chris, thanks so much for joining us. U.S. President Joe Biden promised initially to arm Ukraine with more weapons that it currently desperately needs against Russia. Do we know anything about the timetable for the delivery of these weapons?
Good morning from Washington, D.C. In his conversation with U.S. President Biden on Wednesday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said they discussed the new weapons, tougher sanctions against Russia, and war crimes in Ukraine. He thanked Biden for the additional $800 million in military assistance. Now, regarding a timetable, U.S. defense officials want to deliver this equipment while Russia is regrouping its forces, including helicopter and artillery systems, in Belarus. The Pentagon said that Russia is not fully prepared for its next push into eastern Ukraine and is trying to get the weapons to the Ukrainian military as quickly as possible. The Pentagon said the new supply of weapons includes 500 Javelin missiles, 300 drones, 300 armored vehicles, 11 helicopters, chemical, biological, and nuclear protective gear, and 30,000 sets of body armor and helmets. The U.S. is also providing an unknown quantity of anti-personnel mines. These are designed to be configured to only be manually detonated. President Biden's agreement to send more weapons to Ukraine came after a video appeal from President Zelensky.
Right, Chris, just a follow-up to that. The Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, had some strong words for countries in Europe that depend on Russia for energy sources. What is he alluding at this point?
Oh, he's wielding that hammer. Putin warned European countries looking to replace energy purchases from Russia that it would be quite painful for the initiators of such policies. Those were his exact words. He said supplies from other countries that could be sent to the Europe, primarily from the U.S., would cost consumers many times more and would affect people's standard of living and affect the competitiveness of the European economy. Now, we all know that the European Union is dependent on Russia for 40% of its natural gas and 25% of its oil. Now, going further, Russia said that if Finland and Sweden revoke their longtime neutral stance towards Moscow and the West and join NATO, Russia would move nuclear weapons closer to those two Scandinavian countries. Meanwhile, in his conversation with President Biden this week, Ukrainian President Zelensky continued to push Europe to give up those Russian energy sources. Priyanka?
Right, Chris, thanks so much for those inputs. Stay with us on this special broadcast. We'll come back to you for more insights. Now, the war in Ukraine and sanctions on Russia are causing even more stress in an already strained global supply chain, something that we at WION have been reporting on, and that was initially brought on by the pandemic, of course. Now, to see what this means for consumers like you and me and their wallets around the world, VOA's Elizabeth Lee has this next report. Take a look.
Farming isn't easy. Like all farmers, Chuck Fry is at the mercy of the weather. But he never expected to have problems due to a pandemic and now a war in Ukraine.
The global supply chain at farm level is a disaster.
Fry is a dairy farmer, but he also grows crops, including barley and alfalfa. Most of it goes to feeding his cows. This planting season, the cost of doing business has skyrocketed.
Fertilizer has almost tripled from last year.
Fry used to pay around $330 for just over 900 kilograms of fertilizer. This year, it's more than $800. The problem started when the pandemic disrupted production and shipping. Then Russia, which produces many fertilizer ingredients, invaded Ukraine. That triggered more shipping disruptions, panic buying, hoarding, and other problems. The entire global supply chain slowed, much like highway traffic, says economist Chris Tang.
The disruptions is like someone, they step on the gas and someone step on the brake,
causing traffic jams and delays.
When you can't get from one supplier, it puts constraints on all the other ones, when there's just not enough to go around for everybody.
Fry says the price of diesel has more than doubled. His tractor holds 1,135 liters of fuel.
Oil is what puts food on the table. This tractor runs off diesel fuel. Without diesel fuel, I can't get my crops in.
Even before the most recent challenges, farmers were already experiencing disruptions in the global supply chain because of the pandemic. They say they were having a hard time finding medicines for their livestock because much of it comes from China. Container ships loaded with cargo from Asia were stacked up at U.S. ports last year. A trucker shortage further delayed deliveries of goods. More recently, COVID-19 cases have surged in China, prompting temporary lockdowns and plant closures. Observers expect disruptions at the world's largest container port in Shanghai, causing a ripple effect globally. Economist Chris Tang expects delays to continue.
In the China's production is stop and go, stop and go. Whenever they shut down, the factories are not producing anything. Then when they start again, so in that case, that creates a traffic jam, just like our freeway.
When supply decreases amid robust demand, prices increase, causing inflation.
Our worlds are all connected. So inflation in one country will also cause inflation in other country.
Back at the dairy farm, Fry says he's had to raise his ice cream prices by 10%.
Ice cream costs have gone up because of input costs go up. Short term, I definitely know food prices are going to spike and stay up there because of supply and demand.
Like many farmers, Fry says he may have to cut back production to offset rising prices and keep the farm that has been in his family since the 1800s. Elizabeth Lee, VOA News, Frederick, Maryland.
Now, for a better understanding about this supply chain crisis, we still have Voice of America's correspondent Chris Casquejo with us from Washington on this broadcast. Chris, thanks for staying on. The rising inflation is a huge concern for all of us. It shows no signs of letting up, and it threatens the prospect of Democrats hoping to keep control of Congress in the upcoming midterm elections. My question to you is, what new policies is President Biden advocating to combat the same?
During a visit to the corn-producing state of Iowa, Biden raised the percentage of ethanol that can be blended into gasoline in the U.S., a move that will lower gas prices, but at a risk of creating more smog and pollution. Now, President Biden has also taken to calling inflation during his public appearances Putin's price hike in the hope that voters won't blame him for higher prices when they head to the polls in the summer and fall. U.S. inflation soared over the past year to its fastest pace in more than 40 years, with costs for food, gasoline, housing, and other necessities squeezing American consumers and wiping out those pay raises that many have received. The Labor Department said that the U.S. Consumer Price Index jumped 8.5% in March from 12 months earlier, which is its sharpest year-to-year increase since 1981.
Right, absolutely, Chris. A top U.S. official, in fact, called for a reassessment of the U.S.-China trade relations in particular, and all this in the wake of the skyrocketing inflation that we just spoke about. What specifically could change? U.S.
Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen made these comments, and she's echoing the comments of many politicians in both the Democratic and Republican parties. She called for the U.S. to pivot away from reliance on China for its key imports, but she is not calling for a systematic decoupling of the world's two largest economies. Rather, she said the U.S. cannot allow countries to use their market position in key raw materials, technologies, or products to have the power to disrupt the American economy or exercise unwanted geopolitical leverage. Yellen said that the U.S. should encourage the development of key industries in U.S.-friendly countries, using the term friendshoring to describe this transition. She also pushed for the development of new trade agreements between groups of willing World Trade Organization members. She described those agreements as plurilateral. Now, maybe more companies will follow the lead of tech giant Apple, which, as you know, is manufacturing its iPhone 13 in India.
Right, absolutely. Chris Casquejo, thanks so much for joining us on this special broadcast, and thanks so much for all those insights. WION World is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.